Good morning everyone. Today we will discuss about agents of pollination. In the last lecture I told you about self-pollination and cross-pollination. I also told you about the types of self-pollination, that is autogamy and geitonogamy, and cross-pollination. In geitonogamy and in cross-pollination, the pollination takes place with the help of agents. Without the agents, the pollen grains are not carried out from the anthers to the stigma of the carpel. The pollinating agents are of two types. These are abiotic and biotic. Abiotic agents are further divided into the two types, wind and water. Wind pollination is also known as anemophily. Wind pollination is known as anemophily. The pollination takes place by the water is called hydrophily. So anemophily and hydrophily, these two are the abiotic components. The biotic agents are animals including insects, birds and bats. They also help to transfer the pollen grains from anther to the stigma. The pollination takes place with the help of the insects. It is called entomophily. The pollination takes place by the birds called ornithophily, and the pollination takes place with the help of the bats. This is called chiropterophily. So, air, or you can say the wind, water, insects, birds, bats, these all are the agents, and these agents are required for the cross-pollination, especially to transfer the pollen grains from one flower to the another flower. In class 12, 2 to 3 types of the pollinations are given, and you have to learn about how the flowers, how the plants, they have been adapted for such type of pollinations. Let us start with the first one, adaptations of the wind pollination. Adaptations for the wind pollination. Anemophily means what adaptations occur in the flower, in the plant, so it can be pollinated by the wind. You will not take all these headings, the lines, very lightly. Each line in NCERT book is very important. From each line, the questions may be asked in the board examination, in the home examinations. So all the headings, each line, you are supposed to cover. So these are the adaptations I have already written here. You also please note down all the headings, these points. In wind pollinated flowers, the flowers are very small, colorless and inconspicuous and nectarless. It means the flowers are very small in size. They don't have the color also because they are not supposed to attract the insect. unnecessarily the colors are absent. Inconspicuous means very small, they are not noticeable even, that whether it is flower, very small flowers, and nectarless also, because their insects do not visit such type of flowers, because the pollen grains, they are going to be carried out with the air current. So the flowers are small, colorless, very small, that is inconspicuous and nectarless. Second, the ovule is single in each ovary. Not so many ovules are there in the ovary. And it's very, very important, numerous flowers packed into the inflorescence. The inflorescence are present. What do you mean by inflorescence? Inflorescence is the group of the flowers present on the twig. In all the wind pollinated flowers, the flowers are grouped together in inflorescence, so it can trap the pollen grains from the air. The flower is not single. So many flowers, they are present in the cluster, in the inflorescence. So if the pollen grains are moving here and there, these pollen grains may be collected by the flowers present in the inflorescence. One example I have written here, this example is very, very important. Tassels of the corn cob in the corn, in the maize. You can see so many projections are there in the corn cob, in the fruit of the corn. So many long projections are there in the plant, and these are called tassels. The tassels are nothing. These tassels are stigma and style. Sometimes there may be the question that what the tassels of the corn cob represent. The answer is this is stigma and style. So the tassels can collect the pollen grains from the air. The next one is the anthers are well exposed for dispersal of the pollen grains. The anthers, they are well exposed, means it is very prominent and it can disperse the pollen grains. These pollen grains can come into the air. The pollen grains are very light, very small, very light. If it will be light, it can easily disperse. Dry also, it makes it light. Dusty in the form of the dust, non-sticky and sometimes winged. So it can move through the air. The stigma are large. It is very large, hairy. Why it is hairy and feathery? To trap the pollen grains from the air, or you can say to catch the pollen grains from the air. So the stigma are large, hairy, feathery to catch the pollen grains from the air. So all these are the adaptations, the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. Few examples are there. These plants, they prefer wind pollination: grasses, sugarcane, bamboo, coconut, maize, etc. Now let us start with the second one, adaptations in insect pollinated flower and water pollinated flowers. Now, adaptations for water pollination. The water pollination is also known as hydrophilic. What are the adaptations in the flower by which the pollination takes place with the help of water? The flowers in this case are also very small, colorless, inconspicuous, odorless and nectarless. Odorless means there is no smell at all. There is no synthesis of any nectar. Second, the stigma are long and sticky. If you will see the size of stigma in all the water pollinated flowers, generally the stigma are very long to trap the pollen grains even from the surface of the water, from inside also. Example like in the case of Vallisneria, Hydrilla, Jostrella, this is a type of the seagrass. Especially in the Vallisneria, the female flowers reach the surface by the long stalk and male flowers are released on the surface of the water. In this plant, in Vallisneria, actually the plants are submerged and the female flowers, it goes upward on the surface of the water with the long stalk, and the male flowers are released on the surface of water. In seagrasses like in Jostrella, the female flowers, they do not go on the surface of the water, they are still submerged, and here the pollen grains, they go inside the water, they are released inside the water and reach to the surface of the stigma. And because the pollen grains in the Jostrella plant, in the seagrasses, they are going inside, the pollen grains generally they are needed inside, they are long, ribbon-like, so they can go inside the water. So these two plants are there, Vallisneria and seagrasses like Jostrella. The adaptations you have to learn that how the Vallisneria and seagrasses, these plants have been adapted for the water pollination. Now the pollen grains are protected from getting wet. They are coated, they are covered by the mucilage. Otherwise, if the pollen grains will be very heavy, they can sink. So, to protect it from the wetting, the pollen grain in water pollinated plants, they are protected by mucilage covering. So these are the adaptations for the water pollinated plants. Now the next one is the insect pollination. The pollination takes place by the insect. This is called entomophily. In all the insect pollinated flowers, the flowers are large, colorful, fragrant, and they are also rich in nectar. Why these adaptations are there? Why flowers are very large? Because the insect can visit the flower even from very far places. That's why the flowers is very prominent, very big, very large, and it is also very colorful. The colorful flower attract the insect. The fragrant, the smell also comes from the flower, and to attract the insect, the flowers, they produce the nectar which nourishes the insect. The pollen grains are sticky in insect pollinated flowers. So when the pollen grains, they come along with the insect, they can stick with the flower, even they can stick with the insect. So the pollen grains are also sticky. The flowers here provide reward to the insect as it provides nectar, Actually, in insect pollinated flowers, this is a kind of symbiotic, or you can say the mutual relationship. Here not only the plants are going to be benefited, the insects are also benefited. Here the insects and flowers both are benefited to each other. This is a kind of mutual relationship. The flowers gives reward to the insect, it gives nectar. So the insects gets nectar from the plant. In return, the flowers are going to be pollinated. So flowers provide reward, that is nectar, and pollen grains reward for insect pollination. The flowers are going to be pollinated. These two examples I have written, these two examples are very, very important. Both the examples have been given in your book about Amorphophallus, the biggest flower it has. It gives floral rewards to the insect. How? This plant, Amorphophallus, it gives safe place to the insect for laying eggs. Rewards to provide safe place for laying eggs. The flower, it gives the shelter to the insect to lay her eggs. In yucca plant also, the moth, kind of insect, deposits its egg into the locule of the ovary, and the flower return gets pollinated by the insect. In yucca plant also, this plant provides a safe place to the moth to deposit eggs, and in return the yucca plant is pollinated by the moth, by the insect. So I covered in this heading anemophily, hydrophily and entomophily. Only these three kinds of pollination have been given in your NCERT and their adaptations. Now, after the pollination, the agents of pollination, the adaptations in the pollination, now the next heading is pollen pistil interaction. The next heading is pollen pistil interaction. The pollen pistil interaction consists of so many headings. That is the recognition of the compatible pollen grain. The first one is the recognition of the compatible pollen grain by stigma, and second one is the growth of pollen tube, growth of the pollen tube, and the third one is the entry of pollen tube inside the ovule. These three headings are there subheadings are there in this heading, pollen pistil interaction. After pollination, where the pollen grain goes, suppose this one is the stigma, style, and this one is the ovule present inside the ovary. If the pollen grains are coming from any flower, not all the pollen grains, they germinate on the stigma of a carpel. The stigma recognize only the compatible pollen grain. Compatible pollen grain means the pollen grain which can germinate, which can grow further on the surface of the stigma. If the pollen grains are not matched with the stigma, with the flower, the stigma reject the pollen grain and further growth of the pollen tube didn't take place. So the recognition of the compatible, only the compatible pollen grains, they germinate on the surface of the stigma, they form the pollen grain, forms the pollen tube, then the pollen tube, it comes inside the ovule and the process of fertilization takes place. You can say that how the stigma recognizes that whether the pollen grain is compatible or non-compatible. The compatibility depends upon the genetic level, because of the presence of some of the chemicals. These headings are not included in detail, but some genetic factors are to be there. When the genes, the pollen grain and stigma, both the genetic level are compatible, in that case only the pollen grain germinates further. After the compatibility, suppose the pollen grain is capable, or you can say is the compatible, then it forms what? The pollen tube. The pollen tube, it comes through the style, it penetrates the style. So the second heading is growth of the pollen tube. Suppose this is the pollen grain, this is the germ pore. The germ pore, it forms the pollen tube. The pollen tube further elongates. The size of the pollen tube depends upon the size of style. Then the third heading is entry of the pollen tube inside the ovule. Finally, where the pollen tube comes inside the ovule, because inside the ovule embryo sac is there. Inside the embryo sac, egg is present. You have already drawn the diagram of ovule. Inside the ovule, the pollen tube enters through the different path. It can enter inside the ovule through the micropyle, through the chalaza, through the nucellus. So depending upon the entry of the pollen tube inside the ovule, the entry of the pollen tube is of three types, that is called porogamy, mesogamy and chalazogamy. If pollen tube enters inside the ovule through the micropylar end, through the micropyle, it is known as porogamy. If the pollen tube enters through the integuments directly, it penetrates the integument, and through the integument, if it enters inside the ovule, it is called mesogamy. And if the pollen tube enters through the challenger end, it is known as, through the nucleus, especially from the challenger end, it is known as challengogamy. So that's all for about the pollen pistil interaction. Tomorrow I will teach you about the artificial hybridization, which is followed by double fertilization, and after double fertilization then I will tell you about the embryogenesis in plant. Before I close this lesson, I request you all to note down some questions for the homework. Please note down. Question number 1. What are the biotic and abiotic agents? What are the biotic and abiotic agents for pollination? What are the biotic and abiotic agents for pollination? Second, write the adaptations in wind pollinated flowers. Write the adaptations in wind pollinated flowers. Question number 3. Write adaptations in Vallisneria. Write adaptations in Vallisneria and sea grasses. Write adaptations in Vallisneria and sea grasses for pollination. Question number 4. Write the adaptations in the insect pollinated flowers. Write the adaptations in insect pollinated flowers. And the last question is, explain pollen pistil interaction. Explain pollen pistil interaction. So that's all for today. I will see you tomorrow. Thanks.